It was April 1945, the month when Germany began to devour itself. The once proud city of Breslau was no longer a city but a wound, pulsing with fire and fear. Soviet artillery thundered beyond the river, buildings crumbled into clouds of dust, and the last convoys of the Reich fled westward under the red glow of burning rooftops. In the railway yard, among shattered windows and twisted steel, a single train waited in the dark. They called it Special Transport Number 77. 24 wagons, sealed, their markings erased with soot. A handful of men from the Waffen-SS guarded it, silent, their faces hidden beneath helmets streaked with mud. The documents listed the cargo as priority materials of national importance. But no one knew exactly what that meant. Some whispered it was the Reich's remaining gold. Others said it carried paintings stolen from museums, and a few claimed it contained something worse, evidence from the camps that could never be seen again. At 10:30 that night, the signal turned green. The locomotive shuddered, exhaling a thick breath of smoke, and began to roll east toward the Soe Mountains. Witnesses later said it moved without lights, as though trying to erase itself from history. On the platform, a Polish railway worker remembered seeing a crate break open as it was loaded. Inside, he swore, were not coins but teeth. The train passed through the valleys near Waldenburg and then into the forests surrounding the Owl Mountains. After that, no one ever saw it again. No wreck, no papers, no survivors. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the Reich's final secret. In the weeks that followed, Breslau fell. Hitler shot himself in Berlin, the Reich dissolved, and the world tried to breathe again. But the mountains kept their silence. Soviet scouts who reached the area found the railway tracks abruptly ending at a wall of fresh stone. Some tunnels had been blasted shut, others buried by landslides. The air still smelled faintly of oil and smoke, as if the locomotive had just passed. When they knocked on the rock with rifle butts, the sound echoed hollow, like a drum. One officer later claimed he heard something metallic far below, something that made him stop breathing for a moment. The Red Army dynamited a few entrances, fearing traps, and left the rest untouched. The war moved on, yet the story refused to die. In nearby villages, people spoke of an underground whistle that could be heard at night. 3 long notes, 1 short. Shepherds said the ground sometimes trembled, as though something enormous shifted in its sleep. Children were warned not to go near the forest after dark. They said the train still ran beneath the hills, circling endlessly in the dark, its wagons filled with the ghosts of those who built the tunnels and never came back. Every empire hides its crimes, but few bury them as deeply as the Third Reich. The Owl Mountains became its tomb. The network of tunnels known as Project REICH'S was built by 30,000 prisoners, dragged from camps like Gross Rosen, and made to carve eternity out of stone. Many died before the work was finished. Their bodies were left where they fell, sealed behind the same concrete walls they had been forced to build. Some historians believe the lost train was meant for those tunnels. The gold, the art, the documents, all hidden away until a final victory that never came. Others think it was destroyed to erase proof of the regime's plunder. But there is another version, whispered by locals for decades, that the train was sealed on purpose, not by accident or bombardment, but by the men guarding it, men who chose to die with their treasure rather than surrender it. In the years after the war, scavengers and soldiers came searching. A few found fragments of rail, pieces of armor, rusted bolts that could have belonged to an armored wagon. Others found nothing at all. The deeper they dug, the more the earth seemed to resist them, collapsing shafts, drowning equipment, swallowing whole excavations in mud. People began to speak of a curse, the curse of the Reich's gold. It was said that anyone who tried to unearth it would lose his mind, his family, or his life. In the 1960s, A Polish engineer leading a team of explorers was crushed when the tunnel roof gave way. Another, years later, was found dead near Walbrzych, his journal filled with incoherent sketches of trains moving through stone. By then, the story had already passed into legend. Newspapers called it the ghost train of the Reich. Treasure hunters arrived from Britain, Germany, even the United States. Governments sent teams to investigate, each time leaving empty-handed. Still, the obsession persisted. The idea of hundreds of tons of Nazi gold lying somewhere beneath the mountains was too intoxicating to let go. For many, it was not the gold itself that haunted them, but the possibility, the sense that history had left something unfinished beneath the soil. The war had ended, but not cleanly. Its veins were still pulsing underground. And so people kept searching, even as the mountain whispered back its warnings. The last witness of the original night, an old signalman named Christoph, once said in an interview, "When the train left Breslau, it made no sound, only the wind. Like it didn't want the world to know it existed. Maybe that's why it never came back." Whether it was buried by bombs, hidden by the SS, or consumed by its own legend, no one can say. What remains is the silence of those tunnels and the echo of iron wheels somewhere deep below. The Sowi Mountains stretch across the southwest of Poland, dark ridges folding into mist and pine. On clear days, they seem almost gentle. But beneath the green slopes lies something far older and colder than nature, a labyrinth carved by the dying hands of thousands. It is here, under this quiet landscape, that the Third Reich tried to build immortality. They called it Project REICH'S, the Giant. Officially, it was meant to be an underground factory for the production of weapons and aircraft parts. In truth, no one outside the SS Construction Corps ever knew exactly what it was. The work began in 1943, when the war was already turning against Germany. The Reich needed somewhere to hide its leaders, its scientists, its secrets. They needed a new heart carved out of stone. Trains brought prisoners from across occupied Europe: Jews, Poles, Czechs, Ukrainians, Russians. Men reduced to numbers, chained together in silence. They were herded through the forest into the mouths of the mountains, where the air was always wet and cold, and where daylight ended forever. Those who refused to enter were shot on the spot. The others disappeared into the dark picks and shovels, their only tools. The tunnels were monstrous, kilometers of galleries, chambers, shafts, reinforced with concrete thick enough to withstand bombs. But it was the cruelty, not the engineering, that gave REICH'S its name. Prisoners slept in the mud, drank water that ran black from the drills, and died by the hundreds each week. The guards simply sealed the bodies into the walls, using cement to hide the evidence. Even now, when explorers enter the lower levels, they speak of an odor that never fades. Not mold, not oil, but something human. When the SS realized the war was lost, the work accelerated. Orders came from Berlin to move priority cargo into the tunnels. Trucks with tarpaulin-covered loads began arriving at night. Witnesses remembered wooden crates marked with the symbol of the Reichsbank, and others labeled only with letters AH. Rumors spread that Hitler's personal collection, the art looted from across Europe, was being buried somewhere under these mountains. And then, in the last weeks of April 1945, came the train. By that time, the roads were impassable, bridges blown apart, the sky alive with Soviet bombers. But rail lines still connected Breslau to Waldenburg, and from there, smaller spurs led straight into the construction zones of Project REICH'S. The engineers knew the routes. The SS knew the codes. A single armored train could vanish there without leaving a trace. Some local workers later claimed they saw the convoy arrive. 24 wagons, a black locomotive without insignia. It stopped near a tunnel entrance at night, headlights doused. Armed guards surrounded the site, shouting orders in clipped German. No one was allowed near. For hours, the men unloaded crates into the darkness. At dawn, explosions echoed from the hills. Controlled detonations, the kind used to seal rock. When the villagers returned after the war, the tunnel mouth was gone, replaced by an unbroken slope of stone. Officially, nothing was ever proven. The Soviet command declared the entire area restricted and closed it off for years. But when the Red Army engineers mapped the underground systems in 1946, they found shafts that did not appear on any German plans. They also found tracks that led directly into walls, as if trains had been driven inside and buried alive. The documents from that survey have mostly vanished. Only fragments remain: sketches of tunnels marked inaccessible, lists of temperatures recorded deep underground, odd notations about magnetic anomalies. Whether those notes were scientific or simply superstitious, no one can tell. What they do suggest is that something massive lies sealed inside the mountain, something the Soviets could neither reach nor fully explain. Decades later, when Poland began to open the old wartime archives, investigators found testimonies from the few survivors of REICH'S. One, a Czech prisoner named Josef Havel, described seeing an SS officer overseeing the loading of wagons days before the front collapsed. He told us, Havel wrote, that what we were carrying would make the Reich eternal, and then he laughed because he knew eternity was already ending. Others spoke of sealed chambers where engines had once roared, and of rails leading into blind walls. A few mentioned hearing muffled sounds, as though a machine still worked somewhere below their feet. The most chilling account came from a Polish foreman who returned to the tunnels in the 1950s. He claimed to have found an old service shaft that ended abruptly in a concrete slab. When he tapped it with his crowbar, the echo was hollow, and from inside came 3 slow knocks, like someone answering. Maybe it was just rock shifting, maybe imagination or fear, or the deep breath of the mountain itself. But since then, every attempt to drill into that section of REICH'S has failed. Equipment breaks, power cuts out, accidents follow one after another. Even today, geologists refuse to enter certain parts of the complex, saying their instruments go mad underground, compasses spinning, batteries dying in minutes. It is easy to call it superstition. Yet, when one stands in those tunnels, the walls sweating, the air motionless, the silence so complete it seems to hum, the boundary between history and haunting feels very thin. The mountain is filled with the memory of work and suffering, of greed and fear, and perhaps also with the remains of that last train, still waiting for the signal that will never come. No one knows how deep the tunnels go. Some passages lead downward until the air runs out. Others twist and loop like veins in a living body. Explorers say that the deeper you go, the more you feel watched, as if the mountain remembers who died there and is waiting for you to join them. The legend of the ghost train may have begun as a story told by frightened villagers, but like all legends, it feeds on what it hides. Beneath the maps and the metal detectors lies something simpler and more terrible. The certainty that human hands once built a grave large enough to swallow a nation's guilt. And somewhere in that grave, a locomotive sleeps in the dark, its wheels rusted to the rails, its wagons full of treasure, or bones, or both. When the guns finally ceased, the mountains were quiet again. Spring crept through the forests of Lower Silesia, soft and green, as if nothing had happened. The war had burned itself out, leaving behind ruins and ghosts, and in the valleys below the Soe Mountains, the villagers began to return. They came back to fields that had turned to minefields, to houses where the doors hung open and the walls whispered when the wind blew. The air was heavy with a strange stillness, the kind that comes only after too much noise. In the weeks that followed, Soviet soldiers combed through the area, searching for what they called special Reich assets. They carried dogs, metal detectors, and maps covered in red pencil marks. They found broken rails, collapsed tunnels, empty barrels and crates filled with rubble. But there was something missing: the train. It wasn't there. It wasn't anywhere. The reports they filed read like fragments of a fever dream. At kilometer 65, track terminates abruptly in solid rock. Area contaminated by oil residue. Presence of unrecorded cavities under mountain ridge. One officer wrote, almost as a confession, "We hear sounds of rolling metal when the wind changes." Another, in a report that was later censored, added, "Perhaps we are not meant to find it." By the end of 1946, the Soviets sealed off most of the tunnels, declaring them unstable. The entrances were buried under concrete slabs. A few soldiers were assigned to guard the site, but within months, even they abandoned it. The forest grew back, covering everything with moss and silence. Yet, the silence was not complete. The villagers still spoke of a hum beneath the ground, a low, rhythmic pulse that came and went like breath. Shepherds claimed their dogs refused to approach certain hills, whining and trembling as if sensing something alive beneath the soil. At night, when the wind passed through the valleys, people said they could hear the long, hollow call of a train whistle echoing from nowhere. The story began to spread. At first, it was a rumor, a piece of folklore to explain the unease that hung over the land. But soon it became more than that. Soviet officers stationed nearby started to disappear, sometimes into the forest, sometimes into the tunnels themselves. Their names were quietly erased from the records. One was said to have entered an old shaft near Walbrzych and never returned. Only his flashlight was found, still burning, its beam pointed at a wall of rock. The local authorities called it superstition. They said the mountain was full of unstable passages, and that anyone who went in was a fool. But those who had lived there before the war knew better. They said the tunnels had become graves, and that graves, when sealed too hastily, remember the living. In 1947, a Polish engineer named Wacław Kurash led a small team to survey the REICH'S complex. He was young, ambitious, and skeptical of legends. His notebooks, found years later, described the work in precise detail. Temperature constant at 12 degrees Celsius, humidity 89%, walls intact, reinforced with steel beams of German manufacture. But near the end of his notes, his handwriting begins to change. The last page reads, "I heard it again today. The echo of engines. We are alone here. But it feels as if something moves behind the wall." Kurash never finished the survey. A week later, his team was found dead, crushed under collapsed concrete. Officially, it was an accident. Unofficially, it became the first of many deaths to be linked with the legend of the ghost train. The decades that followed did little to quiet the myth. People came and went, regimes changed, the Iron Curtain rose and fell. But the mountain stayed the same. Hunters stumbled upon rusted fragments of rail deep in the woods. Children playing near the old shafts found pieces of twisted metal and blackened glass. Once, during a drought, part of the hillside near the abandoned line gave way, revealing what looked like the roof of a buried wagon. Before anyone could investigate, the slope collapsed again, swallowing it whole. Those who lived nearby began to treat the place with a kind of wary respect. They would not walk there after sunset. No one cut wood from that part of the forest. Priests occasionally blessed the ground, but only during daylight, and never alone. Every few years, a stranger would arrive, a man with a camera, a journalist, a foreign researcher, and start asking questions. They all left disappointed or changed. Some returned months later, pale and shaking, saying they had heard the train. By the 1960s, the legend had taken on its own life. It wasn't just about gold anymore. It was about something hidden, something the war had buried so deeply that the living could never dig it out without paying a price. In the cafes of Walbrzych, old men spoke of a curse. "The mountain feeds on greed," they said. "Every time someone comes for the treasure, it takes another life." And perhaps it did. The records from that time mention a series of strange deaths. A geologist who fell into a shaft while taking measurements. An army officer found drowned in a flooded tunnel. A miner crushed beneath falling rock, even though he was standing outside the excavation zone. Each incident was dismissed as coincidence, but the pattern was too precise to ignore. Then, as if tired of being hunted, the story went quiet again. For almost 20 years, no one searched for the train. The forest thickened, the paths vanished, and only the whisper of steel on stone remained, faint and constant, like a memory that refused to fade. History moved on. Poland rebuilt. The Cold War ended. But beneath the calm surface of those mountains, something still waited. Maybe it was only rust and stone. Maybe it was something else, a shadow of the Reich, a hunger that had learned to survive in darkness. Whatever it was, the people of Walbrzych learned to live with it. They called it the mountain's heart. And though no one ever saw it beat, they swore they could hear it slow and patient deep below the roots of the earth. For decades after the war, the story of the vanished train slept beneath the surface, half buried like the gold it described. Yet every so often, something stirred. A rumor, a discovery, a death. And the silence cracked again. The people who lived near the WWII mountains had learned to treat the legend with the same respect they gave to the graves of the fallen. Outsiders came to laugh at it or to chase it, and almost all of them left changed. The first to break the quiet were the engineers of the 1960s. Poland, eager to industrialize, sent teams to survey the mountains for minerals. They came with modern drills, maps, and certainty. Among them was a man named Tomasz Lenz, a geophysicist who considered himself a rationalist. He dismissed the ghost train as a fairy tale for superstitious peasants. In his journal he wrote, "The only thing buried here is bad geology." He and his team began excavating near Walbrzych in the spring of 1964. The weather was unusually cold that year. The soil was hard, and the machines stalled constantly. After 3 weeks, they struck a layer of reinforced concrete, thicker than anything the survey maps predicted. Lenz was thrilled. He thought he had found part of an unfinished German bunker. He ordered his men to drill through. The next morning, the drill bit snapped, and 2 workers fell ill. One claimed he heard a noise from inside the wall, not echo or vibration, but the faint clank of metal and a low, rhythmic hum. Lenz laughed it off until that night, when he too woke from a dream of wagons moving in darkness. The journal stops abruptly on the entry dated May 19, 1964. "We opened something we shouldn't have." 2 days later, the site collapsed. 3 men were buried alive. Their bodies were never recovered. The government sealed the area and classified the report. Lenz's widow later received his notebook in the mail, pages water-damaged and reeking of oil. The handwriting on the final line was not his. It said, "It's still running." After that, the legend changed. It was no longer about missing treasure. It was about a presence. The locals began to say that the gold was cursed, that the SS had performed rituals before sealing the tunnels, binding the treasure to the dead who guarded it. Others claimed the curse was older, that the mountains themselves rejected what had been hidden inside them. The superstition spread quietly, like a disease. In the 1970s, under the communist regime, treasure hunting was banned. That only made it more tempting. Soldiers stationed nearby reported hearing explosions from abandoned shafts, as if someone were secretly digging at night. In 1978, a group of young miners from Świdnica disappeared while exploring a collapsed gallery. Only one was found, his face frozen in a look of such terror that the rescuers refused to continue the search. He never spoke again. Psychologists would later describe it as subterranean hysteria, a reaction to confined spaces and low oxygen. But the villagers whispered that the mountain had taken its toll again. 5 men for the 5 wagons filled with human remains. When a priest tried to bless the site the following spring, his cross rusted overnight. The myth began to take root even among those who didn't believe in ghosts. Journalists wrote about the Polish El Dorado. Radio hosts speculated that the train contained stolen Jewish gold or the lost amber room. Archaeologists rolled their eyes, but listened anyway. The line between history and obsession blurred until they became the same thing. Every decade brought new victims, dreamers, soldiers, scientists, each convinced they would be the one to uncover the truth. They spoke of lights flickering deep underground, of compasses spinning wildly, of a feeling like static crawling along the skin. Their stories were all different, yet all ended the same way, with a sudden silence and a grave made of stone. By the time the Iron Curtain began to crumble, the curse of the REICH'S gold had already woven itself into the identity of Lower Silesia. People began to joke that it wasn't a curse at all, but a form of protection, that the mountain was guarding the past from those who would dig it up again. The few who dared to continue searching did so in secret, leaving offerings at the tunnel mouths, coins, candles, scraps of paper with prayers written in trembling hands. And yet, something else was happening. Something quieter, stranger. The older villagers started to die off, but their children dreamed of trains. Not ordinary trains, but ones that ran without sound or steam, gliding through the earth with their windows full of light. They would wake in the night hearing distant wheels and the echo of voices speaking German, Polish, Russian, languages twisted together in a single wordless song. Psychologists called it collective trauma. The villagers called it remembrance. In the 1980s, as Poland strained under martial law, the ghost train returned to the newspapers. A rumor spread that a Soviet expedition had secretly recovered the gold and smuggled it east. Others claimed it had never been gold at all, but documents, evidence of what happened in the concentration camps. Theories multiplied like cracks in the rock. Every one of them carried the same unspoken fear, that the train was still down there, waiting. Even the rational voices began to tremble. In 1988, a German historian named Helmut Krüger came to investigate the archives of REIC'S. He was meticulous, methodical, and utterly unsentimental. He spent months cross-referencing Soviet and Nazi documents, dismissing superstition at every turn. In his final lecture before returning home, he said half-jokingly, "There is no ghost train, only ghosts of our curiosity." A week later, he was found dead in his hotel room, a heart attack at 52. On his desk lay a single item, an unmarked train ticket from Breslau to Walbrzych, dated April 1945. After that, no one laughed anymore. The curse of the Reich gold was no longer a whisper in the forest. It had become a mirror, reflecting greed, fear, and the stubborn refusal to let the past stay buried. It reminded everyone that every treasure has a price, and that some are paid not with money, but with the slow corrosion of the soul. Those who lived near the mountain began to say that the gold was never meant to be found, because it was not the gold that mattered. What slept beneath the ground was memory, the weight of all the crimes and all the dead, condensed into metal, sealed in darkness. And perhaps that was the true curse. Not that it killed those who sought it, but that it forced them to look too long into what humanity is capable of becoming when it believes its wealth will outlast its conscience. By the time the 21st century arrived, the story of the ghost train had become something between folklore and obsession, the kind of legend that sleeps lightly, waking whenever the world grows quiet enough to listen. For decades, the mountains had kept their silence, but in the summer of 2015, they spoke again. It began with a single sentence in a local newspaper. 2 men claimed to have found the lost Nazi gold train near Walbrzych. The names came later. Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter, amateur explorers armed not with shovels and torches, but with modern ground-penetrating radar. Their discovery spread like wildfire. Within days, the story leapt from Polish tabloids to BBC, CNN, Der Spiegel, a headline wrapped in gold and ghosts. They claimed their instruments had detected something long and metallic, buried deep in a hillside, between the 61st and 65th kilometer of an old railway line. The shape, they said, was unmistakable. A train, roughly 90 meters long. They even hinted it might be armored. To make the world believe them, they submitted a formal claim for a 10% finder's fee. "If the treasure is real," one of them said, "history will finally pay its debt." The world wanted to believe. Tourists flooded Walbrzych, hotels filled with reporters. Treasure hunters arrived from Germany, Britain, even Japan. The forest roads clogged with cars, and every night the hills flickered with flashlights as strangers wandered through the trees, searching for the place where the mountain might give up its secret. The air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. For the first time since the war, the Polish government took the legend seriously. Teams of military engineers and geologists arrived, equipped with magnetometers, drones, and seismic sensors. The army set up a perimeter. The police blocked off nearby roads. It felt less like an archaeological dig and more like the preparation for an exorcism. Officials spoke carefully. "There are indications of an anomaly," they said, but no confirmed evidence of a train. The phrasing was perfect, vague enough to preserve hope, cautious enough to avoid embarrassment. But to those who had lived in the shadow of the story all their lives, it was enough. Hope, after all, was what had kept the legend alive for 70 years. In August, under a haze of heat and expectation, the excavation began. Bulldozers rolled in, their engines echoing across the valley. Reporters counted the hours, broadcasting live updates to millions. And then, something odd happened. The machine stopped. At first, officials said there was a technical issue. Then they blamed the terrain, the rock, the weather. Finally, the spokesman for the regional governor gave a statement that sounded like a riddle. "The ground does not wish to be disturbed. No train was found. The anomaly on the radar turned out to be a natural formation." At least, that was the official explanation. Within weeks, the military packed up and left. The site was fenced off and declared environmentally protected. The diggers went home, the crowds dispersed. But the men who had started it all did not give up. Koper insisted that what they had uncovered was only part of the truth, that there was something deeper, hidden beyond reach. "They stopped too soon," he said. "The radar showed more than they are willing to admit." For the locals, the entire episode felt like déjà vu. Another wave of curiosity, swallowed by the same invisible hand. And yet, beneath the disappointment, there lingered a deeper unease. Some said they heard tremors during the excavation, faint vibrations that rippled through the earth like the beating of a buried heart. Others spoke of static interference in cameras and cell phones, as if the mountain itself had reacted to being touched. The old people nodded and said the curse was awake again. In the following months, small accidents began to happen. One of the workers involved in the dig was injured in a car crash on a clear road. Another fell ill with a sudden fever. A journalist who had covered the story wrote an article about the hysteria of the gold train and died of a heart attack 2 days before its publication. The coincidences were enough to revive the whispers. The mountain takes back what belongs to it. Still, the world wanted closure. Scientists returned with new instruments, producing images that looked eerily like wagons, rectangular shadows stacked beneath the hillside. But none dared to dig again. Funding dried up, permissions were revoked, and a year later, the government quietly shut down all access to the area. By then, it no longer mattered whether the train was real. The obsession had already done its work. Television specials called it the last secret of the Third Reich. Economists speculated on its worth, billions perhaps, while historians argued that the true treasure was not gold, but truth. And truth, like gold, has its price. In the cafes of Walbrzych, the locals watched the frenzy fade. They had seen it all before. The strangers, the machines, the promises. They knew that the mountain never gives. It only loans curiosity long enough to feed on it. When the excitement died down, they returned to their ordinary lives, leaving the forest to its quiet breathing. But the legend did not die. It evolved. Younger people began to share drone footage online, strange heat signatures, blurred shapes beneath the canopy. Some swore the recordings captured movement. Not human, not mechanical, but something else, like the shadow of a train sliding through the ground. Conspiracy forums called it der Zug des Schweigens, the train of silence. Others said the gold was long gone, that the train itself had become the treasure, a relic of madness that could no longer be unearthed without unleashing it again. In truth, no one knows what lies beneath those hills. Perhaps only rock and soil. Perhaps the last breath of a dying empire. Perhaps a machine that was never meant to stop. When night falls over the valleys, the air grows still, and the forest listens. Those who live nearby say that if you stand on the old railway line at exactly midnight, you can feel a faint vibration under your feet, steady, patient, eternal. And if you close your eyes, you might hear it too, the slow rhythm of wheels turning somewhere deep below, carrying their cargo of silence through the dark veins of the earth. 70 years after the fall of the Reich, the mountains of Lower Silesia remain unchanged, patient, indifferent, beautiful in a way that conceals their scars. The pine forests grow thick over the ruins. The tunnels breathe quietly beneath the moss, and the wind still carries the same uneasy echo when it moves through the valleys. Time has softened everything, except the question that refuses to die. What lies beneath? Historians have tried to answer it with logic. They talk about Operation REICH'S, about unfinished bunkers and industrial plans, about chaos in the final months of the war. They show photographs of tunnels, maps with red markings, records of trains that vanished when the Reich collapsed. Their explanations are tidy, rational, and comforting. But they never explain the hollowness in the mountain, the magnetic fields that distort compasses, the brief, inexplicable tremors that shake the forest floor. The geologists say it's natural. The engineers say the structures collapsed long ago. Yet when asked why radar scans still show geometric shapes deep underground, no one has an answer. When asked why every attempt to reach those shapes ends abruptly, with broken drills, sudden floods, or accidents that defy probability, the room always falls silent. Among the locals, the theories are simpler, older, and far more convincing. Some say the Soviets found the train in 1946, stripped it of gold, and buried the evidence. Others say the SS blew up the tunnels from inside to protect what they carried. Not wealth, but proof. Documents, names, ledgers, the anatomy of a regime built on death. There are whispers that the mountain itself became a vault for crimes, that somewhere in the dark lies the final archive of the Third Reich, sealed in a sarcophagus of concrete and guilt. But the older generation, those who still remember the sounds after the war, the tremors, the cold wind that came from nowhere, they tell a different story. They say the train was never found because it was never meant to be. It did not disappear. It transformed. Its cargo was too heavy for the earth, not in weight but in meaning. They say that the gold, the bones, the paintings, the documents, all of it fused together, melted by the hatred that created it. What remains down there is not treasure, it's memory. Memory is what the mountain keeps. It is what makes the birds go silent when the mist rolls in, What makes the air colder near the sealed tunnels? What makes people lose their way, though they've walked the same paths all their lives? It's what makes the compasses spin. Some nights, travelers who take the old road between Walbrzych and Wrocław swear they've seen a light gliding through the forest, low and pale, moving faster than any car. They describe it as a shimmer, a ghost of metal. Others speak of hearing a faint whistle that fades the moment they try to follow it. Scientists dismiss these accounts as imagination, tricks of acoustics or temperature. But the stories continue, they always have. Perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps the ghost train is not a single thing, not an engine or a legend, but a reflection of the century that birthed it. A mirror of greed and fear echoing through time. The gold may have been real once, the wagons and rails may have existed, but the greater weight lies in what people carried inside them when they tried to claim it. The belief that wealth can buy absolution, that power can outlast death. The Reich fell. Its cities burned. Its leaders died. Its flags turned to dust. But the hunger that built it, the hunger to own, to conquer, to bury the truth, that never died. It only changed shape, went underground, and kept moving. The ghost train is that hunger given form, forever circling the darkness, searching for a destination that no longer exists. And maybe that's why no one ever finds it. Maybe to find it would be to face ourselves, the part of humanity that digs and kills and hides, hoping the earth will keep our secrets. The mountain knows better. It remembers everything. At night, when the wind moves across the slopes of the Sowi Mountains, it carries a sound that doesn't belong to wind or trees. A deep, distant vibration, like the breath of something sleeping beneath the soil. If you stand still, you can feel it in your chest, steady and rhythmic, the ghost of iron wheels turning slowly in the dark. Some call it imagination. Some call it history. But those who have heard it know there is no difference. The train is still running.